Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of The Subcontinent. Our program aims to address the most significant issues in the subcontinent that affect the government, communities, organizations and the region as a whole. We will try to explain and explore its geopolitics, untangle the arguments from different perspectives and make the alternative voices heard.
In this edition of The Subcontinent, we are going to take a look at false claims by Western media in regard to mass killings by the Taliban in Panjshir. And we shall discuss Iran's full membership in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and its regional and international effects.
After 20 years of occupation and war crimes, NATO forces led by the United States have left the Afghan nation in humiliation and disgrace, to a point where international media outlets have dubbed the operation a second Vietnam for the US. And now efforts are underway already to instigate a civil war in Afghanistan. The premise for this war is the conflict between Taliban, which runs the country now, and a group of people in Panjshir. But what is the reality behind the story? Is the narrative of opposition in Panjshir real? And why are the American media giants displaying such an effort to magnify the scale of this conflict and shape it up as a civil war?
National Resistance Front in Panjshir. This phrase was repeated over and over by Western media in the past few weeks in their efforts to portray a civil war inside Afghanistan. But how close are these reports to the facts on the ground? Since the exit of US military forces from Afghanistan, Taliban forces made efforts to prevent any fighting with the citizens of Afghanistan, to avoid any international incidents and anti-Taliban sentiments to grow. To this end, Taliban fighters prefer to avoid any chances for the ignition of a civil war. Despite their efforts, Western media have done their best to show an image of an unstable and broken Afghanistan after the departure of the United States from the country, after 20 long years of occupation and war crimes by the US military, and by creating fake news reports regarding the battles in Panjshir Valley, news that are completely lacking in factual terms, because there was basically no fighting in the region. It seems that this media campaign was designed with the purpose of creating grounds for possible military intervention by the West by portraying an image of Afghanistan in distress.
Facts on the ground in Panjshir indicate there are no opposition forces in the region and there are no battles or wide-scale conflicts taking place. There are even news stories and a plethora of fake images regarding Pakistan's military interventions in the battles, which drew strong reactions from many. The real issue in this instance was the reluctance of a group of Panjshiris to cooperate with Taliban forces and essentially surrendering control to them. It appears that due to the Taliban's new policy of non-aggression with other ethnicities in the current state of affairs, this will not continue. And as we have seen in the past week, the media brawl will de-escalate and things will go back to the status quo.
Afghanistan is in a peculiar situation today. The root cause for a major portion of the challenges and the instability and insecurity in the country can be traced back to invasive policies and strategic errors made by the US violation of the country's sovereignty. The Taliban have agreed to reduce the violence in the country in exchange for the exit of foreign military forces from the country. In the midst of a hasty withdrawal by the US and NATO forces and the Americans abandoning public negotiations, they managed to increase their advances in Afghanistan and control a majority of the Afghan territories in a short time. With the escape of Mohammad Ashraf Ghani, former Afghan president, the Taliban saw a clear path to form a new government. Despite continued resistance in some parts of Panjshir at the time, the Taliban introduced their cabinet and eventually managed to take indirect control of the region with minimal fighting and a ceasefire. Now, in contrast to all the false media claims by Western media on the security of Afghanistan and the approach of the Taliban government, the country enjoys relevant peace and security across its soil. Now we must wait and see what the Taliban's long-term goal will be to maintain this security for good.
Now, to have more insight, we are joined by Mr. Syed Inayatullah Andarabi, who is an author and political analyst from London. First of all, welcome to the program, Mr. Andarabi. And since the very beginning of the departure of US forces from Afghanistan, Western media started spreading false information on the breakout of civil war in the country. Now, I wanted to see your take on the aim for this media narrative.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Yeah, US media is spreading false information, you're right. But actually the problem with US is that they don't want things to be settled. They don't want an impression to go out that there was an issue, there was an Afghanistan problem. Now it has been settled. Now there is peace. US does not want this impression to go out because it wants a pretext should always remain for US to make its interventions, not necessarily to send army or make a physical invasion or anything like that, but things should be problematic for US. That suits its interest and that suits its power projection. So it's basically for that US is creating the impression that there are Daesh, there is this, there is that. Although Taliban can take care of that, they have demonstrated that they can take care of security issues, security problems. But the US has an interest in spreading the rumors that things are not settled there and we need to be engaged. We can't disengage.
Sir, my question is, will the United States allow such regional developments to continue without interfering again?
Yeah, US will not intervene as it had, but this region is strategically important for US because of 2-3 things. One is Iran, and that's the main issue, and the other is the Central Asian, the mineral wealth and all that, and the third thing is China. So the US cannot just leave it and just completely disengage itself and not to keep an eye on what's happening. So US will keep its actually some intelligence, US intelligence may already be there. So US will keep an eye and US will closely monitor what's happening. Particularly, it's very much worried about China making inroads. And China is the only country at the moment who are not making many noises about what Taliban government should look like and what they should do or they should not do. They have pledged aid for Taliban, and because their Belt and Road Initiative, Afghanistan is very important to them and it means a lot to them. Actually, so many Chinese companies have already committed investment in Afghanistan. So US is very much bothered about all these things. So US will keep an eye on this region.
Sir, I also wanted to ask about the Panjshir conflict. Were there ever any realistic hopes for the Panjshir Valley to hold back the Taliban sweeping through the country?
Yeah, to my mind, Panjshir should have not come up as a resistance. They were actually the Ahmad Shah Massoud's son, Ahmad Massoud. They were in Islamabad, and Ahmad Shah Massoud's brother, Wali Massoud, was also there. I think they should have struck some deal with Taliban in a sort of seeking accommodation rather than confronting them. Because to be realistic and just not being partisan, just realistically, Taliban had been giving resistance to US forces all along these 20 years. I mean, they were part of resistance against the foreign occupation. And now the US has left, and they have come to Kabul and controlled Afghanistan. Now, people should seek accommodation with them rather than confronting them. Because this Panjshiri people, Ahmad Shah Massoud and others, Ahmad Shah Massoud's son and others, they were not a part of resistance against US. So now that Taliban has controlled, they should have gone to Taliban and somehow sought a place within their power structure or made some negotiated settlement with them. That's what I mean, rather than confronting them by force. So that was doomed to fail, and it failed.
Thank you, Mr. Andarabi, for your precious time and knowledge. And now, let's take a look at how people have reacted on social media on false claims by Western media in regard to mass killings by Taliban in Panjshir.
This user points to the increasing misinformation by social media, as well as structured propaganda inside and outside of Afghanistan. Usman Ibrahim believes that although Taliban atrocities are not even near to what US has done, the Western media are putting all the blame on Taliban and vindicating the actual culprits. Also, this tweet is about Western media's narrative in which Afghanistan suddenly has a food and healthcare crisis caused by the Taliban over a few weeks.
The annual meeting held by heads of member states of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Dushanbe, Tajikistan's capital, was grounds for a historic action: the announcement of the permanent membership of the Islamic Republic of Iran as the 9th member of this organization. Iran has been present in this organization as an observer member for about 15 years, and its request for full membership was rejected by the SCO several times in the past. Now, in partnership with the founders of this alliance, that is China and Russia, the country was able to join this organization, which will be significant in its influence in the subcontinent and East Asia. This event will have deep impact on international relations and interstate relations worldwide, and a good many international media outlets have chosen to focus their news segments on analyzing and reviewing the story. But what is the reason for this volume of attention that this event is receiving?
The admission of the Islamic Republic of Iran as the 9th official and permanent member state to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is an important event in the road to a new world order, and it will be considered as a turning point in the international arena in the years to come and the history of international relations, shifting the balance of power from the single-polar hegemonic dominance of the United States to a bipolar balance of power between the West and the East. This turns out to be exactly what Henry Kissinger, former U.S. Secretary of State and renowned American strategist, had warned U.S. officials about before. American exceptionalism in its extreme can lead to the loss of American hegemony in the post-Cold War international order. Zbigniew Brzezinski, former U.S. National Security Advisor, has put an emphasis on this point in his book, The Choice: Global Domination or Global Leadership, and describes the hegemonic efforts by Washington after the events of September 11 as a deadly poison for the survival of American hegemony in the world. Now we must take note that the addition of Iran to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization does not equal its membership in an Eastern Bloc, but rather lays the foundation for the formation of a new Eastern Bloc against the international hegemonic order created by the United States in the post-Cold War era.
Creating a political security network between the member states of the SCO can bring an end to all the dreams of Western countries to complete the NATO initiative of convincing regional countries to join the European and US-led Security Pact. When the countries of the subcontinent can solve their political and security issues under an international pact and even converge in an Eastern Bloc to provide security in the region, there will be no need for the US, UK and other NATO members to deploy their troops to this region. This is exactly why the US may find Iran's full membership in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization largely alarming. When we consider the fact that the United States is no longer the hegemonic power of the globe and cannot claim guardianship for the American order in the world or the post-Cold War order, this event proves to be more significant than previously perceived.
Tehran has faced unilateral and illegal sanctions by the United States, and these sanctions have served as an enormous obstacle to the country's economic transactions with its neighbor states in West Asia and even some of the nation's allies. The Iranian economy has progressed to a point of adaptation to these sanctions, and despite a relative hiatus during the former administration, Iran has implemented effective and resolute measures to render the sanctions ineffective. The financial prowess of Tehran was one of the reasons that convinced parties of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to accept Iran as a full member, to benefit from such potential to form an economic, political and security bloc against the United States. Now, after the announcement of the full membership of Iran in the SCO, the damaged yet resilient economy of Iran has a chance to revive itself quickly. And in addition to the benefits that will serve the livelihood of Iranian citizens and the macroeconomic structure of the country, this opportunity can greatly help Iran in furthering one of its foreign policy objectives, that is, a strategic resistance towards US hegemony across the globe.
Now, to have more insights, we are joined by Mr. Andrei Kortunov, Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council. Now, Mr. Kortunov, welcome to the program. Now, Iran has been a participant of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as an observer member for around 15 years since 2005. Now, what was the process leading up to this strategic move in cooperation with member states to grant Tehran a full membership?
Well, SCO initially started as an alliance of countries with a common communist legacy. It was China, Russia, and three post-communist states of Central Asia. And there were discussions within the institution whether it should get deeper or it should grow wider. Of course, it was not an apparent solution, but later on, when they finally decided to accept India and Pakistan, it became clear that the concept of a wider institution prevailed. So Iran was a natural next step to make, and I think that it became clear that Iran would be a member.
So what role does Iran's membership in the SCO as a ninth state play in creating an economic network in the East?
I think that without Iran, you cannot complete any major Eurasian integration project. If you have a white spot in the center of Eurasia, your initiatives are likely to be not complete at best. Iran is very important in terms of transportation, both east-west and north-south. It is important as an integral part of the Eurasian energy system, but also in terms of its manufacturing capacity, in terms of its research potential. Clearly, this is an asset for SCO.
Mr. Kortunov, how will Iran's membership in the SCO affect the illegally imposed sanctions by the US against Tehran?
Most of SCO members are under US sanctions. You take Russia, you take China, you take now Iran, and unfortunately they all are targets of the US sanctions policy. Definitely, if you take private businesses of these countries, sometimes they might feel obliged to abide by the US sanctions in order to avoid secondary extraterritorial sanctions that the United States can impose on them. But if you take public companies, if you take regional development institutions, I don't think that they will be eager to follow the sanction policy of the United States. So when these countries act together, they might make a stronger case against US sanctions, and they might somehow mitigate the negative implications of sanctions for their economies. For example, they can move away from using dollar in their financial transactions. Definitely that would be a major step to make.
Sir, there are speculations that Russia and China played an effective role in convincing other member states to accept Iran as a full member. Now, what are your thoughts on trilateral ties between Tehran, Beijing and Moscow?
Well, I think that such a trilateral partnership would make a lot of sense, because SCO is very diverse. As I mentioned, there are countries with sometimes divergent, even conflicting interests. So with all due respect, I think that we need also a closer, a smaller, a more concise partnership. And definitely there are issues between Russia, China and Iran that could and should be discussed. I think that a trilateral partnership between Russia, China and Iran would make a lot of sense. Because SCO remains a very diverse international structure. Some of its members have divergent and even conflicting interests on important issues of global and Eurasian politics. So I would personally hope that we will have more formats to discuss many international problems in the trilateral framework.
Thank you, Mr. Kortunov. So glad to have you here on the program. Now, let's take a look at how people have reacted on social media on Iran's full membership in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and its regional and international effects.
Ben Norton considers Iran's membership in SCO as a sign of the strengthening of a new Eurasian bloc to counterbalance the US-EU-NATO hegemony. Said believes that Iran, China and Russia have changed everything, and we are about to see a new world order. Sayed Mohammad Marandi refers to the fact that Iran's membership shows that US did not have enough influence to convince other countries to block Iran's entry. Also, Mohsen Shariatinia opines that Iran is turning into a bridge between East and West, as well as South and North of Eurasia.
And that was our episode on false claims by Western media about mass killings by Taliban in Panjshir and Iran's full membership in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and its regional and international effects. Now, to watch the best bits of our show and more subcontinental updates, follow us on social media platforms and don't forget to give us your feedback. We shall meet again, same time, same day, next week. So till then, take care.